Welcome back to the podcast. Today I'm joined by Milissa Ormiston with IPX 1031 Exchange. We go through the entire process and different types of 1031 exchanges. If you're a real estate investor or interested in buying, selling real estate, this is definitely the episode for you. And if I haven't met you yet, my name is Connor Webb. I'm a mortgage broker, mortgage advisor with Advantage Mortgage. It's my job to assist my clients with figuring out the best home loan financing for their needs, whether it's a primary residence, secondary home, investment property, you name it. If you'd like to get in touch, my contact information will be in the description of this video. And a big shout out to Dev's Coffee Bar. They are the sponsor of this podcast. This is their podcast studio. If you are located anywhere around Southwest Washington, make sure to check out one of their 3 locations. And if you're a big coffee guy like I am, make sure to check out orderdevs.com. Use code CouchGM for free shipping off your order. And if you enjoy this episode, make sure to like and subscribe to the YouTube channel for more content like this. And let's get into it. Okay, cool. Well, Milissa, thank you for joining me on the podcast today, talking all things 1030.
Are we recording?
Yeah, we're good. we're
recording already?
We're in it.
Already.
We're in it. Talking all things 1031 exchange. Looking forward to this conversation. I know there's a ton of detail and different layers to it. I was at your class the other week to where you were giving a presentation and a lot that I had not heard of before. So appreciate you coming on and sharing your story and looking forward to getting into it.
No, I appreciate it, Connor, a lot. It's always good because trying to get good information out there. As we know, just because you Google it doesn't make it real.
Right.
So I always like to have the opportunity to answer questions and kind of make sure people understand, what do I need to do if I'm wanting to do a 1031 exchange? What does that mean?
Right. So let's start with your background.
Sure.
You were a real estate agent before, and then you got into 1031. Just walk me through your background briefly.
Sure. So I was a real estate broker licensed in Washington and Oregon for 14 years. During that time, I was involved with close to 1,000 transactions. So I did quite a bit of business. Got out in 2017, and I've been doing 1031 exchanges ever since. Kind of wanted to change of scenery. I just didn't get that far out of the real estate business.
Yeah.
So I've been doing this going on 8 years now.
How did you decide to go to 1031 exchange?
It found me.
Okay.
I was, like I said, just looking to get out of the kind of the rat race of being a real estate broker. It's a lot of work to keep your pipeline full. And I had been in corporate business to business sales for many, many years. So I thought, I'll get back into that. And just by random found this job, and I've been doing ever since. And I kind of joke that it works with my squirrely brain because I'm a little on the ADD side, and it's kind of an art and a science when it comes to 1031 exchanges. It's like a puzzle, right? So we have all these puzzle pieces, and people come to me and they're like, the pieces don't fit together. And so it's always good to be able to kind of see that big picture and move those pieces around so they fit and work.
So overview, what is a 1031 exchange and who would be using that?
Okay. So when we talk about 1031 exchanges, we're referring to a section in the tax code. So the IRC 1031, and that section is referring to when an investor is selling real estate and they want to buy more real estate, and allows them to defer the capital gains tax on the sale of the relinquished property and buy another piece of replacement property that's also investment real estate. So it is a tax code for investors, and it is involving both the sale and the purchase of real estate for investment purposes. And it's only a deferral. It's probably a really bad adage, but it's kicking the can forward.
Right.
So there are definitely exit strategies out. So it's worthwhile for people to go through the process of doing a 1031 exchange most of the time.
And so a 1031 exchange is specifically only for investment properties. You
Correct.
Can't be exchanging to another primary residence.
Correct. So the primary residence falls under a different tax code, which I don't have a problem touching on because it's important to understand that. And that is the IRC 121 tax code. And the way that tax code reads is it says, as long as I own and live in it as my primary residence for at least 2 of the last 5 years, I'm eligible for an exclusion of gain of $250 as an individual, $500 as a couple. So it's really a better tax code because it's an elimination of gain. And that's where the primary residence falls under that tax code. Now, sometimes I'll get people that'll call me that haven't lived in the home for 2 years and now they want to do a 1031 exchange. And unfortunately, it's not in qualified use because it's my primary residence. Now, there are circumstances when that might. Where I might be able to use both tax codes, either what we would call a mixed use. So, say someone has a duplex and they live in one side of it and they rent out the other, then they can utilize both tax codes, the 121 for the unit they live in, and then exchange the other portion. So, that would be one example. Or if someone lived in the home for at least 2 years and then they turn around and they rent it out and they go to sell it, well, it's an investment property now, so it is eligible for a 1031 exchange because it's currently as an investment. But if they still have at least 2 of the last 5 years, so I'm selling it before I moved out for it has to be within 3 years of moving out, I'm selling it. I'm still eligible technically for the exclusion of gain. So let's say I have a property where I have maybe $800,000 of gain. I can get the first 500 tax free. I get that exclusion. And then I can roll into an investment property and defer the other $300,000 of gain. So you're able to kind of utilize both tax codes. So there are times when you are using both, depending on the circumstances.
Interesting. Yeah. Because I've had clients with questions about, yeah, rolling forward the potential gains from primary residence to another primary. So it sounds like that is partially an option. You have to live in a property for 2 out of 5 years.
And it's
And
an
then,
elimination versus rolling
yeah,
forward. So the IRS changed the tax code for our primary residence. I believe it was in 96. So it was a different tax code. I never remember that. And it went from a deferral. So what it was prior to was I was able to defer the gain by buying a new replacement primary residence of equal or greater value within a 2 year period. My guess is what the IRS realized is that there became a point in time when people didn't want to buy a new primary residence or they didn't want to upsize, right? I'm retired. Maybe I don't want a new home. I'm going into a retirement community, or I don't really want to buy up. And so people at the end of their work life and everything now all of a sudden had to pay taxes on all the sales. So they changed it to an elimination of gain instead.
was there a 1040 something exchange that you mentioned at your class? I think there might have been a different one that you mentioned.
Maybe we were talking about the
I know you got into a lot during that class.
it was very detailed. That might have been on 1245 on a cost seg.
Very well could have been.
That might have
A lot
been.
of different numbers. Yeah.
Yes, yes, I know. I a lot of them I just go, "Phew," but there are some that stick. But the 1245 is on a cost seg, which is a completely different animal and probably would be a whole podcast
Yeah.
just on its own. And would not be, I don't know, 12, I think of a 1040 as your tax return.
Right. Right.
So,
Makes sense.
and I don't remember the tax code for the primary residence before it moved over into being the 121 tax code. And I don't think I
Okay.
referred to that the other day.
Yeah. So back to the 1031 exchange or the 1020. So can you walk me through the forward process? And then there's also a reverse
Yeah.
process.
So, like we were talking about earlier, in a 1031 exchange can be a little bit overwhelming because there's a lot of little nuances, but the basics to an exchange never change. There's certain criteria that always happen. So, one is I'm always selling real estate, I'm always buying real estate, and to meet the like kind requirement, I need it to be for investment purposes. So I don't have to sell single family home to buy a single family home. I just need to be selling and buying real estate for investment purposes. So that's one key element. Timing is really important. You want to always hire and engage the services of a qualified intermediary. That's who I work for with IPX 1031 Exchange. That's all we do is facilitate exchanges. So you need to engage our services before you close on the sale. Never buy or sell anything without us. You've done something wrong at that point. It just means you're going to pay taxes, is what that
Yeah.
means. Um, and then everything is from the point of closing on the sale. From that point, you have a 45-day window to either close on or identify what it is you're going to buy. And then you have 180 days, including that 45, to complete the exchange. So it's the 45-day deadline to identify that's the really crucial deadline that we want to really keep in our forefront of thought process when we're trying to move forward, because it's really easy to want to move forward to the 180 days because that's just like, oh, that's no problem, I can make that happen. 45 days though to identify is really, really critical. So I always like to think of it when I'm explaining the process to people that there's really kind of two things going on. There's the real estate part, and then there's the exchange. And the real estate really doesn't change, right? So the client's going to list their property for sale. They're going to accept an offer. Escrow will be opened up. They'll find a property they like. They'll make an offer. Seller accepts that offer. Is opened up. So that part really doesn't change. It stays the same. Now, we need some cooperation clause on the 1031 exchange as a term and condition in the contract. Most contracts that real estate brokers use already have 1031 exchange language in it already. There's no special disclosure criteria or anything like that. It just depends on a state by state, what their contract has. Or if I'm doing like a for sale by owner, just throw in a cooperation clause. Not a big deal. Sometimes people think it's a contingency, and it's not. It's just a term and condition. Just think of it as the money is going to a third party to hold, and that's really the only thing. It really doesn't impact the other party at all.
Hmm.
Um, so then there are the steps that we take as part of the exchange. So first is you hire the qualified intermediary before you close on the sale. The funds at closing will come to the qualified intermediary to hold on behalf of the taxpayer. And then that 45-day deadline to identify is going to be a physical step that the taxpayer takes on or right before day 45 that has nothing to do with buying real estate. So I always want people to know, and there's a couple rules. The most commonly used rule is the 3 property rule, which is exactly like it sounds. So they can identify up to 3 properties regardless of value. They're not required to have it in contract to identify it, nor do they have to buy everything that they have identified. The catch is you can only buy what was identified on day 45. So what I always want to have people understand that while I'm not see if I can talk, required to have it in contract, it's probably in my best interest that I have what I intend to purchase in contract. I'm going to identify that property. And then if I choose to, I'm able to identify up to 2 more properties as backups. If I was going to be conservative, I probably want to be through inspection before day 45 because that's the biggest point of failure in a real estate transaction is inspection. So that if something comes up in that inspection that the seller's not willing to work with me on, or I'm not willing to live with it, I still have time to secure another property before day 45.
What documentation is needed to identify a property? Is it just a screenshot of a Redfin listing, or do you need?
No, it does have to be in writing. So very, very good question. It does have to be in writing. It does need to be signed and dated by the taxpayer and then receipted in. Now um, there are different sources that you can provide that to. Most people are going to identify to their qualified intermediary. We pretty much 98% of the time, the client identifies with us. And that's a good way to do it because then it's part of the paper trail. So if the client's ever audited, part of that paper trail shows that they properly identified and then purchased what was identified on or before day 45. Now, if you don't identify on day 45, it then would be considered a failed exchange at that point because I haven't identified.
So if you don't identify enough properties in that 45-day window, then you automatically incur the tax.
No, so it's not, I don't have to identify anything before day 45. In fact, if you close on your replacement property before day 45, it is considered automatically identified without the additional step. Many times we'll do that just to sew it up to make sure it's really clean. But it is considered automatically identified if you close on it before then. Otherwise, when I get to day 45, if you don't submit an identification in some manner, it would be then considered failed at that point because you did not identify anything. So you're not able to move forward with the exchange. And then the taxes would be due when they do their return next year.
Gotcha. And then, so let's say you get under contract on one property that ends up becoming a sale fail. If you were to have a sale fail, then you have those other two properties that you have to choose from.
And then if they're not available, I'm done. So that's why I don't want to have a fail sale happen after day 45. If I have it happen before, then again, it gives me time to secure the replacement property. So really it's advisable to people if they're thinking about doing an exchange, talking to a qualified intermediary before they even list the property for sale. That way they understand the deadlines, what qualifies, what doesn't, what does a fully tax deferred exchange look like. Really make sure they understand what they need to do and have it really clear in their mind what they need to go do to be successful. And then once they go to list the property and then they've accepted an offer, now they can go and start making offers on a replacement property, feeling pretty confident on what they need to do at that point.
And walk me through, we were talking about it off air a little bit, the difference between like an escrow company and a independent third party that's
Right.
handling the
A qualified
exchange.
intermediary.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I get a little bit itchy with the term escrow because with doing real estate sale transaction, you use an escrow company to, or an attorney on the East Coast to facilitate your sale of your real estate, and the escrow company or the attorney does the transfer of funds and the transfer of title, right? So we have this third party that handles that transfer for both parties so that before that really existed, you're handing someone money, but did you get title to the real estate, right? So that's why that is a necessary part of how we handle real estate transactions in the US, right? Is having that third party. So when people talk about escrow, I want them to not think of us as escrow per se, because I think that's like this magical place that money goes to be held. And it honestly goes into an individual bank account for
Mhm.
each client. We are a third party, so I can't be both your escrow and be a qualified intermediary. I have to be completely separate. You also can't hire your own attorney or CPA. Part of that is because we're specifically precluded by the IRS from giving legal or tax advice. And so you can't hire your own attorney or CPA. I think it has to be like a 2-year period from having them be your legal or tax advisor to be able to engage their services to act as your qualified intermediary. So that tends to either be a company like IPX, where we're a national firm, this is the only thing we do, or it could be, locally, it could be a smaller company that specializes in it that's either an attorney or a CPA.
So the money that, so the initial transaction closes through an escrow account.
Yep,
Then they would send the money to you,
right.
and then you would send the money to the new escrow account to help with the purchase of the next property.
Yes. So what happens, so unlike in a real estate transaction where I hire escrow for my sale and then hire escrow for my purchase, the qualified intermediary handles both sides, both your sale and your purchase. Once you've engaged our services and we have a contract in place, we then provide instructions to escrow on how to move forward, including where the money should go at closing. So then it is wired to us at closing. We set up a bank account in the client's name, taxpayer, and then the money is held, and then we coordinate with escrow to provide the funds for the purchase.
And a big shout out to Dev's Coffee Bar. They are the sponsor of this podcast. This is their podcast studio. If you are located anywhere around Southwest Washington, make sure to check out one of their 3 locations. And if you're a big coffee guy like I am, make sure to check out orderdevs.com. Use code CouchGM for free shipping off your order. So if someone were to sell a property, the funds hit their account, there's no way of avoiding the taxes at that point.
Yes, for the most part. So there could possibly be. I've never had anybody do this, but we've had cases where people have come to us after the fact. If they can unravel the transaction, So that means the buyer has to agree to no longer be the owner of the property. You have to go back into title
Oh,
of the
wow.
replacement property and close escrow again. So obviously, if the buyer has a loan, you're never going to be able to do that. It would have had to have been a cash transaction. And then you have to sweet talk that buyer
Like,
into
hey,
no,
sorry, I messed up. Can
hey,
you
by the
please?
way, you want to be not entitled anymore, right? And let me like rebuy it from you.
Yeah, that's rough.
Yeah, that's about it. So the point of no return is close of escrow. Even if the money was sitting at escrow, it's too late.
Okay.
So you have to have engaged our services prior to. And I had an unfortunate situation. It wasn't my ideal, but they reached out to me and he was trying to fix it for his girlfriend or fiance or whatever because they had sold a piece of property and now they were doing their taxes right from last year. And the CPA is like, oh my gosh, she's going to owe all these taxes. You should see if you can fix it so she can do an exchange. And unfortunately, sometimes I've had CPAs unfortunately send people to us after the fact thinking that they could do an exchange later and you can't. But in further conversation with him, he had bought a new property, but he hadn't done an exchange. He had it in his mind he had done an exchange, but he just bought more real estate. So the unfortunate thing is, even though I might have bought more real estate, I didn't do an exchange. So I always tell people if you've bought or sold something without us, you've done something wrong and you're going to pay the taxes.
Makes sense. Yeah, use the expert. How soon in the process would you recommend someone reaches out to you if they're thinking about completing a 1031?
Before they list the property would be ideal. The only reason is because again, there's so much kind of misinformation out there. I want to make sure people understand, hey, day 45 is really important. What does that mean to them? What does a fully tax deferred exchange look like? What can they buy? And have kind of a really good idea and be well educated on what they need to do. And again, then once they have an accepted offer, now they're ready to shop in earnest because they know what they need to do and they've got an offer. It's kind of the stages of real estate, which us being the business, we understand that the toughest offer to get accepted by a seller is one that's contingent upon me selling my property. Next best one is contingent upon successful closing. So now I've told the seller, well, yeah, I do need to sell this property, but I have an accepted offer with a closing date.
Mhm.
And of course, the best one is non contingent. I've sold my property, but then my clock has already started on my exchange, which 45 days is not a very long period of time. And a common question I get is, well, who fails? How many failures? I don't have a real high failure rate. I think probably because I beat the poor 45-day horse to death a little bit. But there's kind of three people that I think of that have a hard time completing the exchange. One is it's the last minute. They didn't know about it. They found out about it at the very end. They're at the closing table almost. I've had escrow reach out to us, the client's sitting there ready to sign, and we can make that happen. But they tend a lot of times they can get overwhelmed that 45 days. They hadn't been thinking about what they wanted to buy, the cost, all of that. So it's kind of the failure to launch,
Mhm.
right? They just end up they don't do it at all because they didn't know about it. And then the next one would be what I call the shiny object squirrel syndrome, right? We have too many ideas. We haven't really narrowed in on what they want to buy. I have somebody right now that's looking at Florida and Texas, and in my conversation with them, or California, so three really big states, right? Is like get a better idea where you want to buy.
Mhm.
What do I want to buy? What does it look like? What kind of price point? And really kind of get that a little bit better defined because otherwise they're kind of chasing their tail and they just have too many ideas. And by the time day 45 gets around, they haven't found anything
Yeah.
because they didn't focus in enough. And then the third one is what I call the needle in the haystack or the unicorn. They have too specific of a criteria. They won't deviate from it. They want something that's way too specific and they don't find that replacement property. So those are really the three that I feel have a high chance of not completing an exchange is they didn't know about it, too many ideas, or too specific in the idea.
And so you work for a national company, and there's no restrictions on if I were to sell a property in Washington, I could buy anywhere in the country.
That is correct. So I can sell or buy anywhere within the United States. Now, a common question is, can I do an exchange into a foreign country or a foreign country into the US? And the answer is no. Both what I'm selling and buying does have to be within the United States. There are foreign exchanges, but they're highly unusual. Um, you have to be selling and buying within the same country, and paying US taxes. And by the way, I'm only deferring my taxes on the gain to the US, not to the other country. So, as far as I know, there aren't any other countries that have something like this. This US is really unusual in that. So, let's say I have a property up in Canada, because it's one I know for sure doesn't do a 1031 exchange type tax code.
Mhm.
So I could be selling my property in Canada and buy another property in Canada. And if I've been reporting income in the US on that Canadian property, I could potentially do an exchange and defer the capital gains to the US. But Canada is still going to have their hand out for the taxes.
Interesting.
So far, whenever I've had anybody ask about doing a foreign exchange, they have not done one. You also have to find somebody that will handle foreign currency and understand international tax laws and international currency laws. So we would not assist with a foreign exchange, just because we're not set up to do it. It'd be probably a bank. And last time I checked, I couldn't even find a bank that was doing foreign exchanges. So it's probably not going to happen. But the good news is I can sell in any part of the country and buy in another part of the country. So a lot of investors are moving their assets around depending on what they feel is a better place for their money to be placed.
Yeah, foreign definitely makes it another layer of
It does.
everything.
It would be appealing, but unfortunately it doesn't work.
What about Puerto Rico?
You can do in a territory, but it's also very specialized and they need to have a CPA that'll be able to help them because there's additional documentation. So even when I've had someone ask about, maybe doing Guam or something like that, they haven't done it.
Are you able to sell a property and spread the profits into multiple properties?
Yeah, so you can sell one property and buy multiple properties, or I can sell multiple properties and I can buy a single larger property. Before we jump into how that would work,
Mhm.
I would say let's talk about what a fully tax deferred exchange looks like. So there's two things IRS is looking for the taxpayer to do, and that is one, buy something of an equal or greater value to what they just sold and put all their cash proceeds back into the new property. And then the difference is offset with a new loan, additional cash, or a combination of. I tell people don't get too hung up on debt replacement because if we try to get too much on that LTV, it just gets you kind of messed up. So if I'm say selling for $500,000 and I have a $200,000 loan, I have 300 in cash to buy 500 in real estate.
Mhm.
So if I just keep that in mind and if I turn around and I buy a $600,000 replacement property, I have 300 in cash to put back in. I'm going to get a new loan for 300,000 and I have a fully tax deferred exchange. It's not an all or nothing. So if I want to trade down or buy down, so same example, I sell for 500 and I buy for 450, doesn't invalidate the exchange. It just means the $50,000 shortfall is taxable.
Mm.
The same is going to be true if I keep any cash out. So again, I sell for 500. I've got a $200,000 loan. I've got 300 in cash. If I turn around and buy for 600, but I keep $50,000 of cash out and I borrow more money, doesn't invalidate it, but it does mean the $50,000 I kept out is going to be taxable, even though I bought a greater value. So those are things we
Interesting.
want to keep in mind. So if I'm selling one property and I want to buy multiple less expensive properties, I just want that combined value to be equal to or greater than what I sold. The 45-day deadline is where I'm going to have to be really careful when I'm trying to buy multiple replacement properties. And then if I'm going to sell multiple properties into one replacement, I just need to remember that my replacement value now becomes the combined value of the sold properties is now my replacement value. So if I sell two $500,000 properties, I want to buy something for $1 million or more.
Mhm.
Um, And timing is going to be really critical on multiple properties. So the first one that closes starts that clock on the exchange. So I find that
The
sometimes
180.
on the 45 to identify.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's
Minimum.
that's
Yeah.
that's the real critical one, right? So the unfortunate thing is when people want to sell a couple properties going into one, it's tempting for an investor to go, okay, well, I vacated this property, right? Move my tenant out, got it ready, put it on the market. Okay, now I'm ready to close on it. Now I'll get the other one ready. Well, a lot of landlord tenant laws, you had 90 days minimum before you can get your tenant out if they cooperate. Um,
Yeah.
so you want to make sure you have all those properties that you're trying to sell going into one on on the market at the same time. And then you want to be really strategic about it. So in most places, the seller's still kind of in the driver's seat. It's softening, but we're still more seller side than buyer,
Hmm.
driving the real estate market. So I would suggest always like a little bit longer closing on that first property, maybe see if I can get a 60-day closing to give myself time to get that next property in contract. They don't have to close on the same day, but you probably don't want it to be more than 30 days apart between the two.
Interesting. Kind of getting into the weeds a little bit.
Of
So,
course.
yeah. So there's a max of 3 properties that you can identify, or that's the minimum.
So there's a couple rules. The most commonly used is the 3 property rule, which becomes the maximum. So the reason this is the most commonly used rule is because most people are going to buy one property of similar value. So that one allows me to identify up to 3 properties of unlimited value. Okay, so let's say I sell for 500, I can identify a $500,000 property, a $600,000 property, and a $700,000 property. That's great. And then I can buy any one or all 3 of those
Mhm.
properties. Okay. Now, there is another rule, which is called the 200% rule. So, this rule, rather than you being limited by the number of properties you can identify, you're limited to the combined value not to exceed twice the value of what you sold.
Mm.
So, I had a guy that was selling a property up in the Seattle area for, I think it was about 1.5 million. And he was going to buy properties down in the Eugene, Oregon area. And he was planning on buying multiple less expensive properties. So, he would use the 200% rule, which says he can identify unlimited number, but the combined value can exceed $3 million.
Okay.
Now, he's not going to buy $3 million in real estate. The idea behind either rule is you're identifying what you have in contract that you intend to purchase, but then you have the ability of identifying additional properties as those backups.
Okay.
So now on the 200% rule, they have to be pretty careful because it's easy when I have it in contract. I know what the price point is. But if I don't, I have to kind of take a stab at the dark,
Hmm.
right? And I'm going to have a reasonable idea of expected value. But what they have to keep in mind is I can never buy it for more than what I ID it for. So if I say it's worth $1 million and then I go and get in contract for 1.1, I can't do it. I cannot buy it for
Are you able
more.
to adjust that value at any point?
Once I've identified it, that's my value.
Oh,
So I can't buy it for more than what I have identified it for. So I have a variance, but it's only down in value, but never above what I ID'd it.
interesting.
So they have to be really careful because they don't want it to look like you over identified. And that's where the challenge becomes.
Hmm.
And then I can adjust as much as 25% less. So let's just use that $1 million value that I assign it for. I can buy it for as little as 750, but I can't buy it for 700 because then I haven't acquired substantially what I was identified. So that would be a legal term. I have to substantially buy what I've identified. So it can't be less than 25% of what I established the market value to be when I identify it. So I can buy it for as little as 750, but not less than that. And I can't buy it for more than $1 million. So they have to be really careful when they're establishing a value on something not in contract.
So it might be a good idea to just identify it as a little higher than what it might be
Yeah.
listed at.
Yeah, exactly. So if the property's on the market for a certain price point, to make sure that I'm falling within twice the value of what I just sold and meeting that 200% rule, I would probably identify it for a little bit more than what the list price was versus,
Yeah.
well, I'm not going to pay that.
Right.
Well, you can buy it for less. But what happens if the seller says, so what?
Approach the seller. Sorry, I wrote on this piece of paper. I can't buy it for
I
more than
can't,
this.
I don't think they're going to buy that one.
Right.
I'm sorry, dude. I can't pay you more than $1
I
million
really, I
because it's
really
on this
want
piece of
to, but
paper.
yeah,
Says that's all I'm going to pay for it.
yeah.
Doesn't really work very well. It's not going to really be a good sell point to
Right.
a seller. In
Interesting.
fact, they're going to go, hmm, so what? Not my
Right.
problem, right?
Interesting.
Yeah.
So that's the forward process of the
Yep.
1031. Now, what's the reverse side?
So a reverse exchange is going to be when you're going to buy that replacement property first and then sell your relinquished property, which seems really appealing until you kind of get into the details of it. A reverse exchange isn't when you're going to buy something and come and tell me that you bought something. That's called no exchange.
Yeah.
Okay. So again, we have to be involved in the purchase as well. A reverse exchange is a little bit different. So rather than us holding the funds for you on your behalf to provide you with what the IRS calls safe harbor, we're going to hold title to that replacement property for you in a special interest LLC called an EAT. We typically want a couple weeks to set up a reverse exchange. Again, we're going to hold title to that property, and then you have 45 days to tell us what you're going to sell and 180 days to complete the exchange. So you have the same deadlines, but instead of telling us what you're going to buy, you're going to tell us what you're going to sell, which most people already know what they're going to sell. The problem is going back to what's a fully tax deferred exchange. So, whenever I want to get into the weeds, as you put it, or more complicated, I want to go back to the basics. So, I'm supposed to buy something of an equal or greater value and put all my cash back in. So, let's go back to my 500,000. I'm going to sell this property for, and I have a $200,000 loan. I'm going to have 300 in cash. Well, what that means to do the replacement is I need to be able to put $300,000 down. I can only borrow above that. Now, the reality is, I say that's the minimum, but most reverse exchanges are going to be an all cash transaction. Because of the structure, and we have non recourse language, and we're holding title in an LLC, residential lenders don't really like reverse exchanges. So that's why it's going to be an all cash transaction. Now, if it's a commercial transaction, we find that they will loan on it. But again, I've got to have some money, or there's some ways to do some bridge loans
Mhm.
to kind of make that happen, but you're still going to have some serious cash to be able to buy the property. Now if it's commercial or vacant land like farmland or something like that, we're going to require a phase 1 environmental study because we're going to be in the chain of title. We will not do like a gas station or anything like that because we don't want to be in any kind of issue with potential chain of title issues later if there ended up being an environmental problem. So we are very particular about those types of properties. So we do require that phase 1, a clean one, within the last year. And then we have to be additionally insured. Now, insurance is going to be another real big issue. A lot of listeners may not be aware or if they aren't in those states, but we are starting to see getting property insurance is becoming a bigger problem because of the increase of natural disasters that we are seeing. So people in California, Texas, Florida, in the Rust Belt, places where you've got the hurricanes and tornadoes and stuff, they're starting to really show some issues in trying to get property insurance. So, and keep in mind, if we're doing a reverse exchange, they have to have property insurance, and
Mhm.
and we have to be listed as additionally insured. So even if you might be paying all cash and you weren't going to do property insurance, you do have to do it while you're doing the exchange.
Interesting. Yeah. So I was thinking off the top of my head, if someone wants to buy a property and then sell it, yeah, if you had financing in house that you do to bridge that gap, makes sense that has to be an all cash purchase. So they would still provide the cash up front for that purchase,
Hmm.
but then the ownership would just be through your company until that sale happens to make it
Right.
all one.
So, what we try to do at the end of the exchange is we have two ways of unraveling it and completing it. We'll either have transfer of title happen. So, I try not to do that because then they're going to pay title and escrow fees a second time because it's like another sale.
Mhm.
So, what we try to do is transfer the membership of the LLC to them at the end. So, vesting doesn't change. We just change the membership of the LLC. And then if they don't want to keep the LLC, the client can go in and record a deed and change it back over into their name if that's what they want to do. Um, but yeah, so I've had people on reverse exchanges, they didn't necessarily have the cash on hand, but they borrowed it from family, friends, hard money lender as a temporary cross collateralize
Mhm.
in other ways to be able to buy it and then pay those loans off when the money comes through. I did have a client once that borrowed about $600,000 from a friend. And you know what I told him? I said, I need better friends. I don't have a friend that's going to loan me 600 grand, but
Right.
hey, cool. So we don't, it's not like with a lender where you have to determine, where did the source of money come from. For
Right.
us, we're not looking at the source. You're coming into escrow with the money, buying it all cash, and then the money will flow through. And really it's going to be a temporary loan because you've got to have it done in 6 months. So
Okay. And then as far as the timelines, is there no real hard timelines with the reverse?
it's the
Because
same. So remember, it's 45 days to identify what's going to be sold, and then they have to
okay,
sell it
identify what's
within
gonna be sold.
180.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. And we will do a non-safe harbor exchange where you're outside the 180 days. I have not had anybody do that. It's a very expensive exchange then because there was a case called the Bartell case in 2016, where they did a personal letter ruling with the IRS because they did an improvement exchange. So that's when I'm buying and I'm doing work on the property. They went outside the 180-day window. IRS tried to invalidate the exchange. They sued the IRS. I didn't know if you knew that you could sue the IRS, but you can.
Gotta
And
try
they
that one out.
no thanks.
Yeah.
And they won the court case. Now the IRS did come out and say, hey, you know what, we don't care on this particular case that it was ruled against us, that they could be outside of the 180-day safe harbor criteria, um, because we're going to still go after invalidating it. So we will facilitate a non-safe harbor exchange going outside that 180-day window on an improvement exchange. That's typically the only time you're going to do it, but it's going to be tens of thousands of dollars to do it, and you got to really want to do it. And like I said, I haven't had anybody go forward with doing that, but yeah, so we can do that. That's about the only time outside that 180-day window is you do a non-safe harbor exchange.
Yeah. How have the tax codes evolved over the, recent years, if they have?
Um, so understand that, okay, so federal taxes started in 1918 and 1031 exchanges started in 1921. So they've been around for a really long time. You might hear people talk about the Starker Exchange, which for us is kind of fun because that is a timber company in Oregon. It was a very groundbreaking, again, they sued the IRS and won. And that made a big change in the exchanges. So someone might talk about Starker Exchange. It's nothing special. It's just it made a big change. So exchanges have evolved over time through case law.
Mhm.
So initially, the client didn't have a limit. The taxpayer didn't have an unlimited. They had an unlimited time to do an exchange. They didn't have these tight
Mhm.
windows. They didn't have to hire someone like us to hold the money. And most exchanges were swapping. So you have a piece of property I like, and vice versa, and we swap with each other. So that was most of the initial exchanges were that way. You can still do a swap. In fact, that is the one and only time you can do an exchange without hiring a qualified intermediary is if you swap real estate with each other and there's no exchange of funds. So it's a direct property and the only consideration in the exchange is the exchanging of the swapping of the real estate. Usually, even with swaps, there is cash because one property is worth more than the other one. You would still hire a qualified intermediary in that particular case because there's money changing hands as well. And then the party that's getting money can either buy a second piece of property or the additional cash is taxable.
Yep. Okay.
Um, there's the only real big change. There were some changes as far as defining short-term rental for investment purposes versus for recreational use, and that was in 2008. They also changed the how it works because I told you the 121 tax code started in the mid 90s. Well, people realized on the 121 shoot, I could move into my rental for 2 years and get an exclusion of gain of $500,000. So investors started moving into their investment properties to get an exclusion of gain. IRS realized they had a loophole and they changed that. So that happened in 2008 as well. So there were some changes there for definitions and criteria from investment to primary. And then the biggest change really was in 2017 when they eliminated personal property exchanges. So that was really the last big change. So you used to be able to exchange personal property if it was for investment. A good example would be a hotel. So I exchanged the real property and then I exchanged the goods within the hotel.
Mhm.
So my cutlery, my china, my linens, my beds, all of those things. But like kind in that was very specific. So if I was exchanging cutlery, I could only exchange into more cutlery.
Okay.
But that was eliminated in the tax code change of 2017. So that's really probably the biggest change was then. And then, like I said, back in the early 2000s, there were some changes. But the basics, they're always like evolving and tightening up through case law, but there hasn't been any real major changes to the tax code in a
Yeah.
while.
And that's a good point, the long term versus short term. So there's no, when you're identifying a property, you're buying it as an investment property, but whatever you decide to do with it, you can short term rental it, you can long term rental it. There's no,
Right. So there's a couple things when we're looking at what qualifies for a 1031 exchange. So if your client, if someone's flipping properties, that doesn't qualify for an exchange. The IRS considers that inventory because your intention is to resell it for profit. It's not eligible for a 1031 exchange. So again, intent. So the two things we look at for qualifications are holding and intent. Holding is a gray area because the tax code doesn't stipulate it unless it's a short term rental. And then they want your holding to be at least 2 years to prove intent. So the real thing that we're looking at is what is the taxpayer's intention? Their intention should be that they're holding it for investment purposes or use in business or trade. So that could be for vacant land, it could be for the long term hold for the appreciation in the land itself. And then when if it's a rental. So I'm getting the rental income plus the appreciation. So I'm getting both appreciation and income producing off of the asset. I can go from a short term or long term rental to a short term rental. Now, if it's a short term rental, the IRS has stipulated, hey, you need to rent it out at least 14 days a year to non-family members at fair market rent. So you have to rent it out. So if I have a vacation home and I don't rent it out, maybe, I let friends and family use it. It's not an investment property in the eyes of the IRS. It's simply a recreational property. I also have to limit my personal usage. So those are the two things they're looking at. So the minimum rental requirement of 14 days, and then maximum personal usage is 14 days a year or 10% of what you rent it, whichever is greater. So if I rent it out 300 days, then I can use it 30 days.
Mhm.
Now, time there for maintenance doesn't count against my personal usage, but I'm going to tell you every CPA I've ever talked to about this is like, be very careful about that idea. They want you to keep a log of the work you've done, keep receipts, maybe photos, so that if you're ever audited,
Mhm.
it doesn't come into question, have you been using it too much for personal use? And you're trying to say it's there for maintenance and you really didn't do anything. And my favorite question I always get is, well, how does the IRS know? Well, they're not door knocking, to see. It's about being reported, treated as an investment property. And if you were to get audited, most people when it's a vacation rental, they're using a property management company. So
Mhm.
there's a log of my rental history and my personal use. And when I talk about fair market rent, that's key. So if I rent it out to friends and family at a discount, that counts against my personal use.
Okay.
So that's why the fair market rent's a key element. It's again to make sure that I'm really treating this as an investment and not just a secondary home.
By the tax code, by the book, if you were to buy, flip, hold for 2 years, then you could do another exchange and be able to defer that tax gain.
So, okay, so when someone comes to me and they want to do an exchange and it doesn't really look like they qualify because um, usually because they don't have holding and or intent, right? If I don't have ideal holding, I want to make sure you can defend your intent. If I've been doing the flip, right? Okay, sure, I could rent it out for a year Um, but most people that do the work don't want to rent it out for a year. And then, well, I like the one where they think, well, I'll just do a short-term rental because then they think, well, I can kind of get away with it. Well, then that becomes a 2-year hold
Hmm.
because I'm now a short-term rental. So that doesn't really work either to just say, oh, well, I rented it out 14 days this year, you know,
Yeah.
because I need to do that for 2 years. So the problem is most of them don't want to hold it for that length of time. But then it also comes down to what am I looking to buy? Because there's kind of two methods of investing, right? I'm the flip where it's quick money, I make more, but it's income producing, so therefore it's taxable as income.
Hmm.
Or there's the long hold for the appreciation and the rental income. There's the two methods. Not one's better than the others, there's two different ways. So my problem is that maybe I have somebody that maybe they could get away with it. The problem is they don't want to buy an equal or greater value and they don't want to put all their cash back in because they want to buy another deal to put money into it to again sell for profit. So once they start realizing, okay, well, maybe I have holding because it was the flip that didn't really go well. And so they've had it for a year and a half or whatever. Then you'd start talking to them about, well, what do you have to buy? Well, then if I go and I sell that one, now I have a trend, right? And there's no cap on how many exchanges I can do a year or how frequently I do exchanges. But if I'm all of a sudden like selling these properties and I'm selling them for quite a bit more than maybe normal appreciation, I've kind of got a trend that could be an audit trap, right? A
Right.
reason why the IRS might take a look at me and question, was my intent really to hold this for investment purposes for that appreciation? Or was I really selling it for the improved value and for profit?
Gotcha.
And by the way, that's like I said, considered inventory and it's taxed as ordinary income. So it's a little bit different of a situation. So, there are times when I have people that, you know, someone's maybe on the fence, but I'll do the exchange. But usually more often than not, when we really get into the details of what they have to do, it isn't what they want to do and they don't do the exchange.
Yeah. What percentage of people that use the 1031 exchange are first time users versus,
Most.
yeah.
Yeah, probably 95 plus percent of the time people have never done an exchange before. And they always kind of start their conversation. I'm sorry, I don't know anything. I've never done this before. And it's like, it's okay. That's what I'm here for. And I started really thinking about why do I like what I'm doing? And I come from this long family of educators. And so at heart, I'm just really an educator. So that's what I'm doing. I'm educating people on how does this work? What do you need to do? Answer people's questions and just have them feel at the end of the day like they know what they need to do to be successful. And that's really what's important to me. And my description is my job is to take a foreign language, break it down, and put it into sizable English bites so that people understand. Oh, that's what that means, especially that identification, because people kind of want to blow right by that and go, oh, this is what it means. Like, no, not really.
Yeah. And
So
then what's the typical referral source, like where are clients coming from?
when I first got into the business, it was primarily escrow officers, to be honest.
At the signing table, like, we have another one.
Yeah, unfortunately, way too many of those, and we still get those, but not too much. Now that I've been doing this for a while, and I really do lead in with education, so I get out there and do a lot of CE classes for real estate brokers and for lenders and CPAs and attorneys and things like that. So my sources are all over, but I do get quite a bit from real estate agents and also from my escrow and title partners. So, but that's and one of the things I do in my class, I'll be doing a three CE hour class tomorrow.
Okay.
And I always say, hey, if there's nothing else you learned today, who do you call when you have a question? Me. And also, I always say when you go on a listing appointment, if the seller doesn't live there, ask the question, are you thinking about doing an exchange? Don't make the assumption that the client knows about exchanges or have talked to somebody. They could also have bad information, like the guy who unfortunately called me after the fact who thought I bought real estate, so I did an exchange. And had to give him the bad news that no, not only did your girlfriend not do an exchange, neither did you. So, I really want people to bring that question up and then allow the client to be educated and make an informed decision on what's best for them. And sometimes talking people through it, paying the taxes is the right answer for them, but it's always good when they can make an informed decision. And sometimes people don't have gain like they think they do because or they have gain and they don't think they do, one way or the other, because a lot of times people think it's the cash equity that's the taxable gain, and the taxable gain is the difference between your cost basis and the sales price.
Okay.
So I could have owned a property for a while and stripped out equity over time through cash out refis, and I could walk away with very little cash and have a ton of gain. But if they think it's the cash that they walk away with that's the taxable gain, they could come up with a surprise and
That's a good point.
and not know until it's too late that they owe taxes. And sometimes it could be more than the cash they walk away with, depending on how much gain they have.
Yeah, that'd be rough.
I have also had people that had a ton of cash equity, but had very little gain for various reasons. And so, and maybe even had a loss, which I had a real estate broker who I was in a class talking about this. And he looked at me like I had horns growing out of my head. It's like, how does someone walk away with cash and have a loss? Well, it's because they didn't owe anything on it, but they sold it for less than their cost basis. So if they sold it for less than their cost basis, there's a loss, not a gain, even though I might have walked away with a couple $100,000. So it's you have to be careful to think it's the equity that's the taxable situation.
Interesting. Yeah, make sure to meet with Milissa if you're thinking about doing anything with selling and buying properties. I mean, clearly you are the expert. Thank you for
thanks
taking
for
the
having
time.
me. I appreciate it. And, maybe we'll have some follow-up to get even deeper in the weeds.
Yeah. How can someone get in touch with you?
Well, you can always Google me. I do know I'm there, but best way, because I'm not going to spell my name and an email address, but my phone number is 503-367-6701. And I try very hard to get back to people in a pretty timely manner. So it's always funny to people and go, oh, thanks for calling me back. I'm like, well, that's my job.
Yeah.
But yes, I'll call you back. I promise.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, Milissa.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
You got it.
All right.